Associate Dean for the University Libraries. I'd like to welcome you this morning to the Frank and Virginia Williams lecture series on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies. We're very pleased to have this opportunity to present this lecture for you. Before we launch into our program, I'd like to deviate from the script a little bit and introduce two very special guests that we have with us that many of you have already met. And let's give them a rousing applause for President Grant and President Lincoln.
Welcome. We're glad you are here. You honor us both.
Thank you, Mr. President. Man, a few words. Well, again, thank you all for being here today. This is a very special time for us, and we appreciate you coming out on this morning. As most of you probably know and have already heard, Frank and Virginia Williams of Rhode Island have made a generous donation of their extraordinary Abraham Lincoln collection to Mississippi State University. This collection, as many of you may have heard, contains over 30,000 items in this collection. It arrived this summer on two 18-wheelers and was an interesting time trying to get that collection into the library, but it's an extremely extraordinary collection, and we're very pleased to have it here at Mississippi State. The collection includes, as you'll see in the galleries in the library, the collection includes rare documents, artifacts, paintings, sculptures, statues. It's just a remarkable collection that will be a huge asset to Mississippi State University, and we cannot thank Frank and Virginia Williams for their generous donation to Mississippi State University. And as if that weren't enough, they've also decided to establish this lecture series. So we're very appreciative to them for their friendship, their generosity, and their support of Mississippi State University. They are truly bulldogs and very close friends of Mississippi State and certainly of the libraries. And we want to thank them for all that they have done. Let's give them a round of applause. I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Judge Williams over the last couple of years, bringing this all together, and it's been a pleasure working with him. He is a force to be reckoned with. He is a man who knows what he wants, and when he sets out, when he puts his mind to something, he makes sure that it happens. And it's been a pleasure to learn from him and to work with him, and I certainly appreciate that opportunity. But I'd also like to introduce to you his better half, his other half, his wife of 51 years, a wonderful woman, Miss Virginia Williams. Virginia, would you stand? Where is Miss Virginia? Virginia is a wonderful woman. She is a teacher. She grew up in Texas and has lived in Rhode Island for many years, thanks to the judge. And she says she still misses Texas, but she loves Rhode Island as well. As many of you, or some of you may know, she is also, or the both of them are also avid dog lovers and have, over the years, adopted many Dobermans. That's their favorite breed, and not only do they adopt the Dobermans, they always get special needs Dobermans, which I think is a special gift and a special for them to do that. And it's great to have Virginia here. She's such a pleasure to work with, so thank you, Virginia. Well, again, we want to thank you for being here for this program. This lecture series, as you'll hear from Ryan Sims and the judge certainly a little bit later, was established to bring leading scholars to Mississippi State to talk about Abraham Lincoln and Civil War studies. And we really do appreciate them for establishing this opportunity. This will be an ongoing event every year. And every year we obviously will have Judge Williams back as well as a leading scholar. And it's great to have that opportunity here at Mississippi State University. Next, I'd like to quickly introduce our other speakers this morning. Obviously, we'll have Amy Tuck, Vice President for Campus Services, Ryan Sims, who is the coordinator of the Congressional and Political Research Center, Whit Wade, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science, Frank Williams, Chief Justice Williams, and our very special speaker, Harold Holzer, who you'll see in your program has a bio. He is the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, and we very much appreciate him being here today. The judge, when he said he wanted to establish this lecture series, he said, "I know exactly who I want the first speaker to be," and that was Harold. So we very much appreciate you being here, Harold. So instead of having someone come up and introduce each of our speakers, I wanted to go ahead and just tell you who the speakers were. After they finish their speaking, they're going to go ahead and sit down so that they can enjoy Harold Holzer's presentation. Before we adjourn this afternoon, I'll come back up for just a couple of minutes and invite you to the next series of programs, which will be at 2 o'clock. So this time I'd like to invite Amy Tuck to the podium.
Thank you and welcome to Mississippi State University, and we are so delighted that you are here in this new facility, the Old Main Academic Center. This is the first of many lectures in the Frank and Virginia Williams Lecture Series, and we are excited and pleased to have you join us as we continue the programs and activities and festivities celebrating the official opening of the Mitchell Memorial Library's beautiful fourth-floor addition, which provides a new home for President Grant's Presidential Library. These events also mark the official opening of the museum containing comprehensive and a great and magnificent Lincoln collection donated by Chief Justice Frank and Virginia Williams. The program this morning is dedicated to the establishment of the Frank and Virginia Williams Lecture Series on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies. This series will greatly enhance teaching and research opportunities for students and faculty on our campus and those abroad. The Williams Lecture will be presented each fall at Mississippi State University and will feature a scholar that is known for his or her work on the life and the times of Abraham Lincoln and the era in which he lived. The Mississippi State family is most appreciative of this tremendous gift that Chief Justice Williams and Mrs. Williams have donated to the library. For it is for their generosity that it will be beneficial to many students and future generations. I've personally had the chance to see the museum and the collection. Words cannot define how magnificent it is. It is truly impressive and very, very remarkable. So I urge you all to take the opportunity to see this. And we are grateful that they have entrusted this collection to MSU. Certainly to the Judge Williams and his wife, I certainly count your friendship among some of my most prized possessions. And there is a saying that I think is adequate today and accurate to say that there's basically 3 types of people. There are those people who make things happen, there are those who watch things happen, and there are those who wonder what happened. And those of us at Mississippi State University, we are most fortunate that Chief Justice Williams and his wife, Virginia, they are making great things happen at Mississippi State. We appreciate you. I would also like to thank the Dean of the Libraries, who is actually at other functions at this present time. She has been absolutely tireless in her effort to make this event a success, and I appreciate her dedication to MSU and all that she has done to make sure that this is a great event. In addition, I am excited to welcome Harold Holzer to MSU as our first speaker for this series. He is one of the nation's leading historians of Abraham Lincoln and his era. He has published over 50 books and received the National Humanities Award in 2008 and the Lincoln Prize in 2015 for his work. We are honored, deeply honored, that he is here today to start this excellent lecture series. So once again, welcome. I know you're in for a great treat, and welcome to Mississippi State University.
I'll try to be brief. The Frank and Virginia Williams Lecture Series on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies, it's going to provide students, faculty, and staff here at Mississippi State an opportunity to attend a lecture by noted scholar of the history of the American Civil War era. The Williams Lecture Series will be presented each fall, so you'll get to come every year. And here at Mississippi State, in conjunction with the collection of Lincolniana that we have now at Mississippi State University Libraries. These scholars will interpret and understand the economic, cultural, social, military, and political decisions made by President Lincoln during the American Civil War, and they'll also discuss the ways in which historians analyze the American Civil War era. The Frank and Virginia Williams Lecture Series on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies represents the continued interest of the Williams in the preservation and interpretation of the life of President Lincoln and the study of the Civil War era. And we hope that you will join us every fall for this lecture series here at Mississippi State. More importantly, we hope that this lecture series will motivate students and scholars here at Mississippi State to actually use the collection. And there are over 30,000 volumes between the Grant Library and the Lincolniana collection on the Civil War era, but I assure you there are still things to write about. Thank you.
Good morning. I called Judge Williams yesterday and asked him if the biography that I had for him for his introduction today had actually come from him, or if he had another bio he preferred that I used. People can be fussy about their bios, you know, especially lawyers. Judge Williams told me, I don't want you to read anything, just hit the high points, keep it informal. That I can do, I said. Are there any particular high points, though, that stand out as higher than others? The first thing he said without hesitation was that he'd been collecting Lincoln memorabilia since he was 11 years old. Since his name began with a W, he sat in the back of his sixth grade class right under a portrait of Lincoln. I liked his face, he says. He began using his lunch money to buy Lincoln biographies, and his collecting took off from there. That collection now contains thousands of items valued at millions of dollars, including a first printing of the Lincoln-Douglas debates that Lincoln himself signed. And that collection now lives in Starkville, Mississippi. Judge Williams is a native of Rhode Island and is a former Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, a court on which he served about 15 years. Before joining the court, he was in private practice for 25 years. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army, having served 3 years in Germany and 1 in Vietnam. He's a graduate of Boston University and its law school. Judge Williams is also a nationally recognized scholar of Abraham Lincoln. His books include Judging Lincoln, Lincoln as Hero, The Emancipation Proclamation, 3 Views, and Lincoln Lessons, Reflection on America's Greatest Leaders. He's the founding chair of the Lincoln Forum and a longtime president of the Ulysses S. Grant Association. Were being a lawyer, judge, and scholar not enough, though, Judge Williams is also an accomplished amateur chef and has appeared on the, I understand, oldest or the longest running cooking show in America, Ciao Italia. I've not known Judge Williams very long, but in the moments I've visited with him over the last few months, I'm struck by his presence. Perhaps what impresses me the most about Judge Williams is when I consider the gargantuan generosity and grace of a man who entrusted his lifelong passion, begun as a boy, to a university that at first he barely knew. He saw that his passion and our interest in it represented the potential to build something far larger than a new wing onto the library. MSU's commitment to the study of Grant, the Civil War, and now Abraham Lincoln, Judge Williams says, right here in the heart of the Deep South, takes us a giant step forward in our ever-challenging quest for civility, common purpose, and national unity. To put it informally, Frank Williams gets it. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Frank J. Williams.
Thank you very much, Whit. Sometimes I think they're talking about another person on this great celebratory week. It's great to be back at State. I'm a Bulldog now. I know I talk different, but I don't think it really matters. Virginia says I need an interpreter down here. And Vice President Tuck, thank you so much for your thoughts about our collection and what it means to state. Ryan, thank you so much. He's gone, I think, there he is in the audience. Ryan, words cannot express our gratitude for your archival work on the collection since it arrived in June. Believe it or not, 1 year. We've got it done in 1 year, or almost unheard of. And this all started with bringing the Ulysses S. Grant Association and its documents about 9 years ago. And if you want to hear that story, come to the opening at 2 o'clock, the official opening. Because now I want to talk about my friend, Harold Holzer. Over 40 years ago, I read an article in Antique Magazine by a young man. I was young then, too. And it was about Lincoln in art, and it intrigued me. We began corresponding, and as then president of the Lincoln Group of Boston, I invited him to speak at Endicott College in Beverly, Massachusetts. Remember that, Edith? So Harold Holzer came with Edith Holzer, and thus began an enduring friendship and collaboration, over 40 years old. We served on Lincoln-related boards together, wrote together, spoke at conferences together, and organized them too. Too many to name. One of his first major books with Mark E. Neely Jr. and Gabor Borit, The Lincoln Image, was completed in my law office conference room in Providence. There would be many books by Harold, over 50 now, and still counting. From Cooper Union to Lincoln in the Press, which received the Lincoln Prize, to the interregnum between Lincoln's election and inauguration, Harold has evolved into the preeminent Abraham Lincoln and Civil War scholar of our or any age. Imaginative, articulate, brilliant, he has carved a place in the Lincoln story. He is a capable administrator, too, whose skills have been honed on Capitol Hill, public television, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has served as president of the Lincoln Group of New York and co-founded with me and other like-minded souls the Lincoln Forum. He has co-chaired the United States Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, on which I proudly served with him, chaired the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation, and serves on the board of our Ulysses S. Grant Association and Presidential Library. Through his works, speeches, op-ed pieces, and interviews, Harold has given us an appreciation for Lincoln's character and leadership, not to mention the unique personal and political skills he used to secure freedom for all in our nation. We live in a time, don't we, when the political Lincoln might be difficult to appreciate, a time in which partisanship is rampant and at the same time widely denigrated. But Lincoln's presidency, as Harold demonstrates, that political ruthlessness sometimes can be used to advance the highest ideals of our country. One example is Lincoln's efforts to seek passage from the House of Representatives of the 13th Amendment resolution. So who better than Harold Holzer to be our first lecturer in what we hope will be a long series of such presentations. So join me in welcoming my friend, Harold Holzer.
Thank you, Frank. I had all of the same reminiscences down to start, so I'm going to spare you my interpretation, but everything he said was true, except that I think that first lecture at Endicott College was not my finest effort. I was really just starting out on the lecture circuit, and Frank was extremely patient. Yes, he was really patient. I am so honored to be the first Frank and Virginia Williams lecturer here at MSU. I'm thrilled to finally have the opportunity to see the campus. John Marzalek and Jean Marzalek have been inviting me often, relentlessly, and I've been stubbornly resisting. I'm sort of glad we held out because this is such a great occasion. And I'm just, part of it is emotional because part of it is about the friendship that Edith and I have with the Williamses, which has included dining and going around Illinois and cruising the Mississippi on Civil War cruises and doing all sorts of great things together. And it does continue. John and Frank and I are going to be lecturing in Florida in a couple of months. And it just continues, and it's a great part of our lives, and I'm so grateful to be here. It's a little daunting, though, to be giving this talk in front of great scholars like Frank and John and George Rabel and Edna Medford, not to mention these two characters, because this is all about I'm going back to my root, and Ulysses Dietz, who is a great art historian and certainly knows about the Grant family more than most. It's a little daunting, but I wanted to go back to my roots with Frank and talk about iconography again today. I thought it would be appropriate. And so in front of Lincoln and Grant, I hope you two guys don't start struggling and wrestling in your seats as I suggest competition. So anyway, great to be here, and there we go. So on April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln sat around the table with his family. It probably did not look much like this scene. But it was reimagined by many artists over the years, even though Lincoln's opportunities to share time with his wife and children during his presidency were in fact very rare. That day, the president welcomed his son Robert home from his abbreviated and rather undemanding service in the Union Army as a member of General Ulysses S. Grant's personal staff. Robert had gotten that plum appointment at his father's personal request. He had written to Grant to ask that Robert get the appointment. And Robert had gone on to witness the surrender ceremonies, at least the preliminaries, at Appomattox a few days before he returned for his meeting with his father. But when he got home from his little war, Robert brought home with him not a photo of Ulysses Grant, but this photo. Lincoln is said to have gazed at Robert's souvenir carte de visite of Robert E. Lee and said, "It is a good face. It is the face of a noble, noble, brave man. I am glad the war is over at last." Well, he had little time to rejoice, as we know, because less than 24 hours later, Lincoln was dead. Up to that point, and immediately after, it can be fairly said that there were only two great heroes in American history, truly great, and American iconography. Iconography being the pictorial accompaniment to the written record of the time, popular prints, engravings, and lithographs that came from commercial publishers or commercial photographers in the mid-19th century in response for popular demand for icons suitable for framing and display in the American home. I mean, of course, the two were George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Or as one mourner and many print captions put it, after Lincoln's murder, George Washington the father, Abraham Lincoln the savior of the country. As abolitionist Wendell Phillips predicted, history will add Lincoln's name to the bright list of heroes led by Washington. That galaxy of Americans which makes our history the day star of the nations. Or as you see in this title, by New York printmakers Kimmel and Forster, they were Columbia's noblest sons, and that's Columbia herself holding laurel wreaths over the two heroes' heads as the viewer is invited to gaze at these scenes from their lives. Washington accepting the surrender at Yorktown, scenes of the Civil War, a slave market at the bottom. But check this updated version. The design is almost identical, save for the inexplicable uncovering of Columbia's breast. We'll have Matt Lauer do a piece about that later. I could think of 100 names to fill in, but that was the most recent. She still bestows her laurels, still wears a symbolic liberty cap, as you see, suggesting freedoms won by the Civil War. But now the scene of Yorktown has been replaced by a scene at Appomattox in the bottom left. And instead of scrolls in the original suggesting documents from the Revolution and the Civil War, now we have the scenes of emancipation and armies of soldiers and laborers returning to peacetime America. Grant and Lincoln, equal claimants, according to this title, for the title Preservers of Our Union. One of Lincoln's eulogists predicted soon after the assassination that in the coming days, their portraits, meaning Lincoln and Washington, shall hang side by side. His prophecy would be fulfilled, but Grant was not far behind in sharing the pictorial glory in the North after the Civil War. And that's the story I want to explore today. The twinned images of these two preservers of the Union, which, if not exactly a competition, because Lincoln didn't live to compete, might not have become a particularly comfortable partnership had Lincoln lived. Washington was Lincoln's hero, after all. Grant was his subordinate. Yet Grant's celebrity was, by 1865, at an apex that clearly put him on a trajectory with Washington, seemingly destined himself to go from military glory to the president's. And by then, the Lincoln family photo collection, which had that Robert E. Lee, included a Grant too. Now this is interesting. Grant, the Lincolns had their own photo album, which concluded relatives and celebrities, and Mary Lincoln dutifully kept it up to date, and it included this image of Grant. Even though Mary, we might say, and this will be an understatement, did not like Ulysses Grant. In fact, she had taken to referring to him as that small specimen of humanity. Jealously adding, as admirers showered gifts and honors at the general, "My husband did the great work of the war, but Grant has all the pecuniary compensations." So was it a rivalry? Well, it was a rivalry that Lincoln missed, not entirely. And to get to that, let's go back 3 years, to the fall of 1862, as General Grant sat in winter quarters in Tennessee. A one-time Confederate soldier turned up at Chattanooga, where Grant was preoccupied with deteriorating conditions there. 10,000 Army mules, Grant reported, had just died or totally given out. There was not another trip left in the animals that survived. Soldiers were on short rations, Grant added. Artillery horses had become so reduced that it would take all belonging to a battery to move one piece, one field piece. But anxious as he was, distracted as he was, Grant managed to find time for a visitor, this former enemy soldier. Why? Well, his name was John Antrobus. He was an artist. He had come on a very special mission, not to fight General Grant, but to paint him. And Grant, busy as he was more than happy to pose. By November 17th, he happily reported to a friend, "Mr. Antrobus left here well pleased with his success, and I hope you will be equally pleased." That friend was a former congressman named J. Russell Jones, then serving as U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Illinois, and a Galena crony for whom the general often provided passes through the Union lines to build his cotton trading business. If that sounds critical, it's right out of the Grant papers, I have to tell you. We won't dwell on their relationship except to say that Jones became the biggest advocate for this painting project. In fact, Jones was on the scene when the artist supplied the finishing touches to it back in Chicago. And so he wrote back to Grant and said, "If anything in this country beats it, I have yet to see it. Antrobus's studio is constantly thronged," he writes, "by people desiring to see it, but only the favored few get in." Finally, the big 8-foot by 6-foot canvas went on display in Chicago. So now I get the big reveal. This is it. One art critic pronounced it a perfect masterpiece that must give its author a front place in the ranks of American painting. Now, don't feel out of it if you've never heard of it or seen it, because it did not enter the front ranks of American painting, nor did John Antrobus. What I find fascinating is that Grant got it right away. Like Lincoln, a very supposedly modest man, very busy, very preoccupied. An artist shows up and says, "I'm a former Confederate," and Grant says, "Come right in. I have time to pose." He knew what it meant to be immortalized visually very early. This is 62. Now, Mr. Jones had another good marketing idea. He would make sure the painting went on to Washington for public display there. It was the perfect moment by then, late 63, for a demonstration of Grant's fame in the nation's capital. Grant's friends were agitating for his promotion to the rank of lieutenant general, the rank George Washington had held. And what better way to publicize this hero from the West than by showing admirers in the East a heroic image clearly patterned after 18th century paintings of George Washington himself. The restless horse held by an aide in the background, the captured enemy field piece, and the general himself staring into the distance, meant in this case, by the way, to be looking upwards toward Missionary Ridge. Whether the painting achieves all that is a question. In fact, Grant looks a little too worried for comfort, in my view, and he's unconvincingly attired in that sash and the single white glove, the other hand uncovered so he can grip his binoculars, a little too daintily for my taste. Meanwhile, his legs and boots dissolve into a glob, apparently too much detail for this artist to handle. But the picture went on to Washington anyway, where Grant's boosters made sure it got exhibited inside the U.S. Capitol in February 1864, Lincoln's birthday, by the way. And imagine what this meant just before the resolution to make Grant commander of the Union armies. It was displayed in a House committee room, a rare honor. Journalists and spectators alike made their way up to Capitol Hill to see it. And guess who made his way to see it too? Abraham Lincoln himself. The president went up to Capitol Hill and take a look. Why? Well, one thing is he had to show some respect for Grant at this point, his only winning general. The other thing is he had never seen Grant face to face. You and I have never met personally. He had written him just a few days after the capture of Vicksburg, and they had not met since. But he had heard, Lincoln had heard, that some of Grant's friends thought the general would make not just a good candidate for commander of the armies, but a good candidate for president in 1864, better than the incumbent, maybe. And Lincoln wanted to size him up, at least as he looked in this painting. The press reported that Lincoln was very gratified by what he saw. Now, that's an innocuous comment. I don't know what it meant, whether it was because Grant deserved the tribute or looked unchallenging in this painting, we are left to imagine. But it is not hard to understand why, and this is the first time really thinking about this talk that I've made this connection. Around this very same time, Lincoln decided to devote a good deal of his own time and his own busy schedule to his own artist in court, a New York painter named Francis B. Carpenter, who was determined to create a portrait of the president reading his Emancipation Proclamation draft to his cabinet for the first time. And now that I think about it, I don't imagine that this was a coincidence. Grant had a court artist near Missionary Ridge. Lincoln would have a court artist in the busy White House. And this is the result. which was almost double the size of the Antrobus grant. Now there's, my painting is bigger than your painting. And eventually it outdid the grant because it went to the Senate side of the Capitol, not the House side, where it's on permanent display today. It was also exhibited inside the White House and on a national tour. And although I would suggest it has plenty of flaws as well, it built an enormous reputation. And in the battle for image primacy, which I would suggest that these two leading American figures had at least subliminally on their minds, Lincoln won round one. The engraved version of the Carpenter painting went on sale in 1866. Lincoln signed on as its very first customer, although he did not live to see it produced, but it became a huge national bestseller. More on this a bit later. But the print version of the Antrobus grant did not come out until 1888, by which time Grant had been dead for 3 years, and the creator of the chromo, a man named W.J. Morgan, had no choice but to advertise it as a souvenir of the great past, though he did cleverly dedicate it to the Grand Army of the Republic, whose 400,000 members certainly constituted a motherlode of potential buyers for the reproduction. Back to 1864. Just a few months after the original painting arrived in the Capitol, Grant himself, to accept his commission as Lieutenant General and at last to come face to face with Abraham Lincoln. The meeting was captured by artists of the day and remained a staple of popular art, as you see here, into the age of the postcard. This is actually a 1909 postcard rendition. At a March 8th White House reception that the president hosted to welcome Grant into Washington society, the nation's leaders gathered expectantly in the East Room. And here is a painting from the period. The general arrived dramatically at 9:30 p.m. What the guests saw was a man so small that he had to step on a sofa, no doubt to Mary Lincoln's horror. That was probably the first bad thing he did in front of Mary, and it was unforgivable after that, in order just to be seen above the crowd. Lincoln, standing to his side, towered over everyone. You see them there, right? Slightly to the right. The crowd at the levee was intense, a journalist reported, and for once the interest was temporarily transferred from the president to the newcomer. The mass of people thronged about him wherever he moved, everybody being anxious to get at least a glimpse of his face. The women were caught up and whirled into the torrent which swept through the East Room. Laces were torn, crinoline mashed, and things very generally much mixed. People mounted tables to get out of harm's way or to take observations. Only when the cause of all this disturbance withdrew, meaning Grant, did the tumult subside. One reporter remembered it as the only real mob I ever saw at the White House. Another witness, Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, complained that cheer after cheer that was provoked by Grant's appearance was rowdy and unseemly. Well, of course, painter Peter Rothermel, whose work you see here, when he recreated the scene, he made it seem much more orderly than it had seemed to eyewitnesses. This is a court painting. In fact, the 56 guests that are shown here assemble neatly in a line, the better for you, the viewer, it's sort of a semicircle, to see and identify them all, despite the fact that a good number of those portrayed did not really attend. That didn't matter because even if you weren't there, the painter thought you should have been there or it would be nice to show you there. This is painting, in fact, the fact that it's a painting of a sort of a royal court is manifested in its title, The Republican Court in the Age of Lincoln. It's not a documentary painting. Its meaning, it has little resemblance to history. It's all about rank and stature. Who are you? How close are you to Lincoln and Grant? This is sort of like the photographs of the great leader in North Korea when he makes one of his appearances. Who's next to him? Who's next to those who are next to him? And who's been thrown out or killed since the last picture was taken? So take a close-up look at the central figures. Grant appears to be about 6'2.5", wouldn't you say? Far taller than he really looked alongside Lincoln. That's one bow to Grant's stature at this point. And you see Mary Lincoln tenderly ministering to another guest of honor, former General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, the old man sitting there. The only problem is that Winfield Scott was at West Point at the time, where he was in a sort of a doddering retirement. There's no way he could have traveled to that reception, but the artist thought it was like a nice bow to continuity. Future Vice President Andrew Johnson is right behind Mary, although he was serving at the time of this reception as the military governor of Tennessee, and much more likely to see Grant at the front lines than on the receiving line. Pretty soon, this imaginary red carpet idea, right, not much has changed, led to mass-produced knockoffs. A grand reception of the notabilities of the nation, again, shamelessly including Grant as if he were a party animal, not at the front. And later, Lincoln's last reception, intimating that Grant had attended the inaugural reception on March 4th, 1865. That was Lincoln's last reception, which Grant did not. In fact, a contemporary illustrator named Mort Kunstler, whose work some of you may know, has continued this tradition in his depiction of the inaugural reception. Grant is at least down to his, I would say, his right size here, but he, of course, did not attend the inaugural. He was busy winning the war. The day after the original painting, the original reception portrayed in the Rothermel painting, Lincoln actually presented Grant with his commission. That's presumably the scroll, as the cabinet looked on. This newspaper engraving of the period, supposedly from a drawing sketched on the scene, still suggests that Grant had grown about 3 inches since the reception the evening before. Such are the benefits of growing fame, I suppose, in more ways than one. But exaggeration always follows a spike in reputation. Sometimes pictures help spike reputational changes. And few generals had earned more accolades, after all, than Grant. Lincoln did not live to see Grant's elevation into an icon of nearly equal status, so we don't know what his reaction might have been, except from the fact that he sat for Carpenter. And he knew that he had to get his image out there, his heroic image, as author of the proclamation, as vividly as Grant's image was beginning to circulate as a master commander. For all of his modesty, Lincoln worked hard for the rest of his presidency to keep his image in circulation, posing for photographers, painters, and sculptors. And for all his own seeming indifference, Grant did likewise. Each of these men was a savvy manipulator of his own visual status, knowing that the results of patient cooperation with picture makers might transform them ultimately into household gods, encourage political support, and elevate their pictures into heirs of the religious icons of old, the first secular icon, and of the first secular icon of American history, George Washington. Now, to get to this turning point, 1864, I'm going to invite you to go back again to 1860, as I'm going to briefly trace how the images began to circulate before they collided in my imaginary competition here. And I'm going to use images that are in the Frank and Virginia Williams collection. And I should have said at the very beginning that Frank's collection has been described as a great private collection, which it is, but Frank never kept it to himself. It was always available for researchers who wanted to study it. He was generous. He moved things around so we could study. He cooked, but you've heard about that. But more important, he made the materials available. And some of his generosity, and some of the great images that you all now have and will have forever, to your good fortune, are shown here. So how did it begin? Well, it began when Abraham Lincoln ran for president of the United States, and printmakers had to introduce him. And he then encountered or gave the printmakers a headache about his beard, because he grew a beard without much warning, rendering all these early images obsolete. And what did printmakers do? Did they do new designs? No, they slapped beards on the old designs. And that's how the Lincoln presidential image began. What about Grant? Well, he made his debut with a full beard, and I mean a full beard. This is a photograph made in Illinois when he was a brigadier general, before Julia got a look at this beard and said, "Are you kidding? Cut this beard down." But it inspired the earliest images of Grant to be published. Here is an image of Union commanders of the Army and Navy, and the good news for Grant is that he makes his debut. By the way, this is another image of a beardless Lincoln with the beard added. And here is General Grant in that beard that he would soon trim down. So this is his debut on the national stage. Adding to the complication with Grant is the fact that this picture began to appear of U.S. Grant. The problem is it's of a different man named Grant, some beef contractor that was working the supply lines in the West, and who posed, and the word got out that Grant had sat for a photograph. That it was not the right Grant did not much matter, because it was a guy with a beard. And before long, heroic pictures, early pictures of Grant were appearing based on the beef contractor. So it gets a little confusing. Another way to judge high demand is not only when printmakers add beards or take off beards or trim beards for new heroes, it's when they use older prints and insert new heroes into older scenes. It sounds complicated, but you're going to get it as soon as I show some of the examples. So this is a print that celebrates the Compromise of 1850. And from its tattered condition, it's like a suggestion of how the Compromise of 1850 came into disrepute. But I don't think anybody just tore at it. It just deteriorated over age. And it's a celebration of three great senators: Henry Clay, who's seated, John C. Calhoun, who's holding a quill, and Daniel Webster, who rests his hand on next to the bust of George Washington. So this was going to save the United States. By 1860, the United States wasn't being saved, despite the compromise. Okay, if you're a commercial printmaker, I'm stuck with this big plate that cost a lot of money, showing John C. Calhoun, who's in disrepute in the North, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who are dead. But look at this cool scene with an angel and an eagle and all this nice stuff. Why don't we repurpose it? So they did, and this is from the Franklin, Virginia collection coming up, the version of Union, simply called Union, based on this photograph, and there's Lincoln. Henry Clay is still there, even though he's dead. Daniel Webster is still there, but Calhoun, he's sort of a pro-slavery secessionist at heart. So Lincoln's head now sits on the body of John C. Calhoun. It happened a lot. I'm just going to show you one other example. John C. Fremont, the 1856 candidate for president, in a rather effete pose, wearing a cutaway coat that Lincoln never wore. But again, when Fremont is out of fashion, Lincoln goes into the scene. You wouldn't think Grant would have that kind of reputation, or that head on other bodies reputation. He did, and that's an indication of how important he became too quickly for the commercial printmakers. He was out in the field fighting battles, wasn't available to take new pictures. So, okay, this is not a bad comparison. I mean, Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready, one of Grant's heroes from the Mexican War, and really a guy who personified the image that Grant would later aspire to, the rough and ready general. I think he was, you can probably tell me, he's a little smaller than Grant. Or should I don't want to be callous. He was even smaller than Grant. So when Taylor becomes unimportant, Grant gets on the head of Zachary Taylor, and there's a new print. At least it's an accurate Grant. Now, if there was any commander who was more unlike Grant than this man, George B. McClellan, I don't know who it was. McClellan was as big a procrastinator as Grant was aggressive. But after 1862, when McClellan is sort of drummed out of the service and replaced as commander of the Army of the Potomac, nobody's buying this print. Not until 64, when he runs for president, is there more need for McClellan. So what do? Well, it's a great equestrian pose. Why not just burnish out the head of McClellan and find a new guy to sit up there? And there he is. Again, good indication of emergence. What do these guys really look like on the battlefield? They didn't much look like this, although Grant was probably a better rider than this print indicates. Well, they looked like this. I love this picture of Grant leaning against a tree. Ivan Schwartz has recreated another Lincoln leaning against a tree from another famous photograph. But this is just sort of Grant looks like he's holding the scroll that Lincoln gave him in the White House, but I don't think that's the case. And here's Lincoln on the battlefield, also posed on the battlefield. Now, no, that is not Ulysses Grant with him, although he sort of looks a little bit like him. That's Alan Pinkerton, the famous detective who was George McClellan's official spy and enemy counter, and always counted about double the number of enemy troops that were really there, yet he became known as a famous detective and spy. Here's another common thread between them, a common foe. One of the most vexing foes for Lincoln, and ultimately for Grant, was the New York newspaper editor Horace Greeley. And yes, this is a whole other range of iconography, political cartoons, some of them criticizing opponents, but some of them lampooning the heroes that we think of as heroes. And in 1860, it seemed to Currier and Ives that Horace Greeley was running the show in the Republican Party. He was the organ grinder, and that's he on the left. Lincoln was reduced to being his monkey, riding on one of his rails as a hobby horse, with a padlock on his mouth, keeping mum. You see the word mum coming out of his closed lips. He was a creature belonging to Greeley, and even 4 years later when Lincoln ran for re-election, and now he's being attacked for destroying the Union and killing it through all of his extra constitutional powers, Greeley is still there at the holding the boat. Do you see him there with a hat? And so he's still very much in the picture as a symbol of this wayward republic and Republican Party. And let's not forget, Greeley ultimately runs the most hapless and sad presidential race in American history against Ulysses Grant for his second term. He's still the only president who died before the votes were counted. It was such a humiliating loss. So again, they have that in common. The fighting was with Grant, and this is a terrific image. The only difference between what happened and the Bible story is that, of course, Goliath won in 1872, not David. Now, here is an interesting comparison. We talked about McClellan a minute ago. This is an 1862 picture by an artist named David Strother, unpublished as far as I know, but it was a cute idea. It's Lincoln using a bayonet to sort of, shall we say, prod McClellan into action against Richmond. A perfect reminder for the ever recalcitrant General McClellan. Compare that to the Grant image that develops when McClellan is the Democratic candidate for president in '64. And here is the first image I know of that talks about Grant as a bulldog. And I know that's very popular here at MSU. It's also popular in Grant iconography. And McClellan is saying, you got to get that guy off the Weldon Railroad, the Confederate supply line. But no, Lincoln says, look at the pack of curs who are cowering. Those are Confederate generals. They chase you. I think it's best to give the old bulldog full swing to go in and finish them. So it's appropriate that Grant, after declining to run for president in '64, although there were plenty of Republicans that might have preferred him, becomes one of Lincoln's great assets. This is another 1864 campaign print called A Little Game of Bagatelle. That's like a pool game or billiards game between Old Abe the rail splitter and Little Mac the gunboat general. Now you'll see a great gunboat general cartoon in the Frank and Virginia Williams collection. What does that mean? Well, there was a story that McClellan withdrew from a battle and watched it from the safety of a gunboat. And he's often portrayed as someone who is a coward in battle. Can't have a worse reputation as a military man than that. And here Grant is one of Lincoln's assets in this game. He's criticizing McClellan. Why he's smoking a pipe, I don't understand, because by then his reputation as a cigar smoker is pretty strong. Sherman is often considered Lincoln's greatest asset in winning the presidency in 1864. It's true he took Atlanta. Ryan Semmes' ancestor, Raphael Semmes, helped a little bit too by losing in Cherbourg. But people underestimate how important Grant was to Lincoln's victory, not only by not running, but by presenting this image of strength and power, even if it was pipe-smoking resolution and it's not accurate. He emerged as an aggressive and courageous counterpart to the reticent general who became the Democratic candidate. He was war. McClellan was peace and lack of aggression. I think that image counterposition was very important to Lincoln's victory, and it's underestimated. So when do Grant ever get to share in an image? Well, they do, because as you probably know, Lincoln spent quite a bit of time in March and April 1865 visiting Grant and the troops at Grant's invitation. Grant was so generous with Lincoln that he thought it would rest him and help him to be less anxious by being at the front. I don't know if it relieved Lincoln's anxiety, nor was it easy, because Mary Lincoln and Julia Grant occupied separate gunboats as if they were in combat. If they had had guns on the boat, heaven knows what would have happened, but they just dueled over dinners and lunches instead. But we got to see some images of these councils of war that in fact took place. President Lincoln at General Grant's headquarters clearly rushed into the marketplace to meet demand, because this could be anywhere USA. There's no detail, there's no accoutrement, there's just a table with a map. The table barely has legs. This is clearly rushed, and it shows popular demand. Sherman, Sheridan, and Grant, all there. There's no doubt who the important people are, because they're staring at each other, sort of stage or movie stares with the inside eye, but that's all right. That's based on photographs. It's Lincoln and Grant. Same for this image. This is a beautiful print. It was actually the cover of my first book, The Lincoln Image. Lincoln and his generals, a bigger cast of characters, Porter and Farragut, Sherman, George H. Thomas, Grant, and Sheridan. Again, Lincoln and Grant face to face. I don't think they ever met with Lincoln sitting on a rock, but it's still a very good image. This is one of my favorite images of the period. It's dated, it's signed W.H. There's speculation that it's Winslow Homer who did this sketch. There's no proof of it. It could be William Homer. It could be somebody named Holzer. I don't know. But it's a lovely sketch. It's got the dimensions of the size right. It's got Lincoln's beard trimmed down almost to a goatee, which was in fact the way he looked. And little Tad Lincoln, who went on some of these trips, Grant in his own high hat. It's just a lovely image. But it's supposed to be at City Point, where they spent much time. Wish we knew more about it. And this is the famous image that emerges. George P.A. Healy's painting, The Peacemakers. This hangs in the White House. George H.W. Bush made his own official presidential portrait, or had it made, standing in front of this picture, because he felt it represented a commander-in-chief who had to fight when he had to fight, but also desperately wanted peace. How do we know he wanted peace? We know that from the rainbow that's bursting out outside, rather obvious symbolism. Very quickly, people often ask me why, if this is the culmination of the Lincoln-Grant relationship, why is Sherman doing all the talking and Lincoln and Grant and Porter are listening? Well, sometimes it's not about the iconography. Sometimes it's about the patronage, meaning who's paying for this? Well, it's not a matter of who's paying, but Sherman and Healy were really close friends. So Sherman got the lead role in this painting. He also was more talkative, so in a way, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't really bend reality too much. This is maybe my favorite print from this experience, although it's totally nutty. It's called Lincoln in City Point. He appears to be conquering City Point, although it didn't need to be conquered. He's riding with Stanton and Grant, who is between Lincoln and Stanton. Lincoln is freeing African Americans, which certainly happened in the wake of the Union Army's march. But did Lincoln conquer City Point? No. The explanation may be that this is by a German printmaker, maybe confused Richmond with City Point. But the truth about Richmond is that it was not a ride of conquest. It was not a triumphant entrance, nor was Grant there. In fact, Grant and Stanton were not sure Lincoln should go. Lincoln did go to Richmond, where he encountered newly freed people of color who greeted him almost worshipfully, if you believe the reports by at least 3 eyewitnesses. This was the scene as he walked the streets. There could be no greater moment for iconography than this. Not much was made of it at the time. Why? Because a few days later, Grant won round 2, or is it round 4 at this point? I'm not counting. And what was the moment? It was this moment. It was Appomattox. There were dozens of images made of this moment. Now, one of the criticisms of these prints is that they began the elevation and canonization of Robert E. Lee, who looked grand and dignified in all of these images. But in his grandeur, in his dignity, he also elevated Ulysses S. Grant, because in his victory, in his magnanimity, Grant became a great person in his own right. And prints confirmed this as they showed, various degrees of realism, the scene. This one was copyrighted by the owner of the home in Appomattox Courthouse, who needed the money desperately because once this surrender ceremony ended, all of Grant's officers took all the furniture away as souvenirs, so he needed money to refurnish. And the scene was confused with Grant and Lee's encounter the next day, an outdoor scene, and Appomattox was portrayed as a great outdoor scene by some printmakers. It didn't matter. No photographer had been there. And the more grand, the better. How about this one? This is more like Yorktown, with the armies actually facing each other. And in symbolic terms, Lincoln was making a final effort of conciliation, which never happened. The problem with this print is that it elevates Davis to a stature that arguably he didn't deserve. Lee, Wade Hampton, and others on the right. But look who is retwining the names of the southern states on the pillars of the Temple of Liberty. There's Columbia again in the middle under her Temple of Liberty, by the way. It's Sherman and Grant. They are doing the hard work of reunification in prints like this. I was struck by this print as I thought of the end of this story. It's a weird print. It's about a tightrope walker of the day named Blondin. He was French. And when politicians were considered to be on a precarious balancing act, they were always portrayed as Blondin. So here's Lincoln as Blondin. And I was struck by the fact that it's a scene in a theater, and that sitting in the theater box is Ulysses S. Grant. As we all know, he could have been in the theater box with Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, had Mary not made it so difficult for Julia to be with her. So Lincoln is alone, and we know what happens next. And then there are scenes of acknowledging martyrdom. This is a very popular scene. And by the way, most of the Southern heroic images that are then published at the end of the war are manufactured by Northern publishers who were just as eager to make money off of the Southern marketplace as they had been when they were complicit in the slave trade. Lincoln was right when he assigned blame for slavery to North and South. And this commercial renaissance after the war is indication of that. But even as Robert E. Lee visits Stonewall Jackson's grave, there are images of Ulysses S. Grant visiting Abraham Lincoln's tomb, the temporary receiving vault at Springfield that does not say Our Sacred Dead, but it was pretty symbolic. By this time, credit for the victory is shared by Grant, Lincoln, a little bit Stanton, but that would soon end. This is a John Rogers group. You have Frank and Virginia's version in the collection. John Rogers, and some great Rogers groups, really great, rare Rogers groups in addition to this one in the collection, and they're on display, you'll see later. But there is a new trinity emerging now. Washington's back. There is the father of the country, the martyr, and I'm reading this backwards intentionally, father, martyr, and defender. The three, this is the American historical trinity after the Civil War. And Grant is in it. He is in the group. Here's another example. Lincoln occupies a slightly higher spot. That's a terrible image of Washington, but we'll leave that aside. But General Grant has got pride of place there. He's up there with those two guys. Let me go back to this for a second. Remember this print? This is the Carpenter painting adapted into a print, a big bestseller now in 1866. Well, in those days, printmakers just copied each other's work without copyright worries. And a guy named Thomas Kelly in New York copied this. What is it missing, he said. Oh, it's obviously missing Ulysses S. Grant. So let's put it in and just make it a generic meeting of Lincoln and his cabinet with General Grant, who's telling them how he's going to win the war. This kind of thing was common. What does it symbolize here? It symbolizes that people were hungry for images of Grant and Lincoln, of Grant particularly, because there were fewer after Lincoln's death. Now, to show you how commercial this could be, Kelly also thought, there's another version of this print I could do. Jefferson Davis and his general, and with General Lee. So this one came out too, and I always think it's interesting to wonder if anybody who bought this print in the South knew that Davis was in the White House and holding the Emancipation Proclamation. There's another example. The Lincoln and Grant symbolize a new American ethos, liberty, with abolitionists, Garrison and Stevens at the top, and Hiram Revels, the first African-American senator in the United States, who occupied Jefferson Davis's seat, old seat, on the left. The result of the 15th Amendment, the practical result of the 15th Amendment. Who were the people who made the efforts of John Brown at the top a political reality? It's Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, the two of them together. Again, reminder after reminder, there had been only three great presidents in American history. Forget Jefferson, Jackson, these were the three. And Grant is going to be perennially in uniform. Now, as family portraits began circulating to show that Lincoln had had a happy family life, even if it may not have been true, what are the decorations in the home that inspired them? You've got Lincoln with Washington, and you've got the Grant family being inspired by a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And here is the next image is one that I saw yet last night at 10 o'clock in the new Grant Presidential Library. And Stephen Canetto said, oh, no problem, I can just put this into your slideshow. And guess what? He really did. So this next image is from the Grant collection. Here's an ordinary soldier's family life returning home after the war. Who does he have in his parlor to inspire him? He has Lincoln and Grant. A high elevation in image. Now, Grant had the image misfortune of living on and on and on through a presidency that had its great points and also had its problems. And then he went on a world tour. And then he comes back, and there were rumors and aspirations that he's going to run for a non-consecutive third term. And now he's saddled with the record, the longevity, and he's barely 60 years old, or maybe not quite 60, but he's got all these souvenirs he's gotten on his world tour, and he's sort of saddled with them. Literally, they're attached to him, the silver spoons and all of the issues he's acquired. And Lincoln's image is out of the political realm. He's a saint. Grant lives on, and he suffers some of the consequences. This is called the Afro-American Family Record. It's an interesting print. Grant is now reduced to being one of the 18 or 19, I'm trying to count, or however many presidents had existed up to that point. The central people are now Washington, Lincoln, and who's in the middle? Frederick Douglass. Grant, who should have been a hero of major proportions to the African American community because of his work in enforcing civil rights after the war, has gone out of favor. He was just there too long to sustain his status in image. Then he dies. He dies a heroic death. I'm going to show you this image because I saw this image for 35 years before I understood what it was. It's a photograph of the actual Currier and Ives shop on Nassau Street. And I don't know who those fellows are standing in the doorway. They're not Currier and Ives, I don't think. Currier was dead by then. It's 18. I found the date of the picture, and I suddenly understood what it was. Look at the black bunting below the names Currier and Ives. And look at the pictures in the window. You notice anything consistent? They're all of Ulysses S. Grant. This must be either after he died or the day of the New York funeral. Their shop is just a block from Broadway, 2 blocks from Broadway, Lower Broadway near City Hall. And this shop is ready to sell pictures of Grant that have been sitting there for 10 years and not selling. Grant is back yet again with another image come back. This is a remarkable picture. How I wish I could blow some of these Grant images. I do recognize some of them, and you may as well. But here he is, like 5 or 6 Grant images in the shop. Once again, late in the day, in the 1880s, the country's heroes have been realigned again, and so they remained for a good deal of American history, only for the Grant image to fall out of favor one more time. Revived again, many of you will recognize this is what I'm told is called a screen capture from the movie Lincoln, and the Spielberg film, and here we have Daniel Day-Lewis and the British actor who is playing Grant, whose name I forget, conferring on equal terms in the closing days of the war. And as we think of how the image evolves in the 20th century, I invite you to remember this is a pre-restoration photograph of the Henry Schrady statue of Ulysses S. Grant in Washington, D.C. It looks great now, and it would have been nice if I had found a photograph of the front of it rather than the back of it. But the point I wanted to make is that way on the other side of town is this, which I know you all recognize. Having just written about its sculptor, a book that'll be out next year, I realized that the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated only 6 weeks after the Schrady statue was dedicated, which is an interesting note. Now, the Schrady was done rather quickly. Lincoln took, well, really 60 years to build, but 10 or 15 active years to get through Congress and construct on the far end of Potomac Park. It was supposed to be located around where Union Station is now, which would have made an interesting confluence of Lincoln and Grant, but it wasn't to be. Architect Henry Bacon and sculptor Daniel Chester French wanted it in their own locale. But I was struck when I wrote my French book, and I couldn't think of where to fit this in. I certainly didn't want to do it in the book about Lincoln, so I did it. I saved it for today. The African American newspaper, The New Journal and Guide, covered the dedication of this memorial and bemoaned its segregated seating, which was brutal, railed against the Republican Party in general, President Warren Harding in particular, and criticized Lincoln. Lincoln was only a reluctant instrument in the emancipation. Well, that's a different discussion. But what I found interesting is in its conclusion, the paper wrote, "We owe President Abraham Lincoln a great deal, but we owe General Ulysses Simpson Grant a great deal more." That's a breathtaking statement for 1922. Whether it accurately reflected black sentiment that year is open to debate, but the fact that they were peers again, even if it was June 1922, is significant as we consider this roller coaster of twinned images. And that the comment echoes the visual record. Grant had more than once ascended to America's political and historical trinity. The results graced parlor walls, monuments, pedestals, as long as the fashion for such decoration endured. That's why it's really great to be part of the appraisal and reappraisals that are taking place now, and especially good to be here on an occasion that brings Grant and Lincoln together in the library here in an altogether different way, the opening of the new Grant Library alongside the newly donated Frank and Virginia collection of Lincolniana and the gallery. So you've seen many of the Williams pictures here today. Do continue to study them. There are so many stories in these pictures and behind them. The images give evidence of evolving political and military reputations and the building of historical myths and legends. Lincoln and Grant may have been modest fellows, one homely, the other short and plain. You guys are movie stars, but it wasn't the case then. But they were never shy about putting their words and their pictures into the public domain and marketplace. And now they both have a trinity, well, it's really a quartet to perpetuate this. And by that quartet, I mean Frank and Virginia Williams and John and Jean Marszalek. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to share this archive with you today. Thank you very much.
I think you all see why Judge Williams wanted to have Harold Holzer as our inaugural speaker. Harold, we thank you so much for being here today and for being such a wonderful scholar and colleague, and we thank you so much for your fantastic presentation today. I think everybody will agree that it was a very enlightening presentation. I'd like to ask Judge Williams to take just a minute and explain the image that you see here, and that's on the front of your program. It's a special print to the judge, and I think he'd like to say a few words about that.
Well, we want to make a small presentation to Harold for his splendid, splendid talk on Lincoln and Grant iconography. This is how we met over 40 years ago. And thank you, Stephen, and of course, Dean Coleman, for all the work you did in welcoming and preserving and displaying the Frank and Virginia Williams collection. One of the signal pieces of our collection is this engraving that you see on the cover of the program, honoring Harold as our first speaker. This is a very unusual, and it's one-of-a-kind engraving by the late Fritz Eichenberg, who I think, and Harold may agree or disagree because he knows iconography better than I do, I think Eichenberg comes as close to anyone of following with the famous Nuremberg engraver, Dürer, Albrecht Dürer. Eichenberg, Fritz Eichenberg, who became a very close friend and a client of mine before I went on the bench, escaped from Nazi Germany in the early 1930s because of the threat to Jews and others from the monster Adolf Hitler. And what he did, he was a young man then, and what he did was to become this accomplished engraver. He became head of the art department at the University of Rhode Island, and before that he was head of the New York institution that dealt with art, which name eludes me.
And me, unfortunately.
Yes, so what happened here is that I wrote him and said, do you have any Lincoln engravings? And he lived only 20 minutes from where we live in southern Rhode Island, and he was gracious and wrote back and said, yes, I have a couple, and this was one. So his wife made posters of this engraving, and also we used it as a book plate. And the library here, the Frank and Virginia Williams Gallery, and Ryan Semmes knows because he's counted all 10,000 of them. Plenty. We have plenty of book plates. So, Harold, we wanted to take a look at this, though, where you see crosses in the eyes representing a Christian, and the determination in Lincoln's face. This was done at the beginning of World War II. And we're glad to have used it with his kind consent. And Harold, we want you to have a signed, Fritz Eichenberg signed this. He was living at the time he did it. Here's the signed, this is the signed engraving, and this is the poster, this is the poster that his wife and Fritz made for us. Very few left. So, Harold, please accept this as our gift to you on the occasion of being the first lecturer.
Harold, again, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation and for being here with us today. Before we adjourn, I wanted to introduce one other special guest that we have here with us, a Grant descendant, Ulysses Grant Dietz. Would you please stand? There he is. We very much appreciate you being here today as well. That concludes our formal program. I want to let you know that Harold will be out in the rotunda signing books if you'd like to purchase a book. Also at 2 o'clock today, we'll have the grand opening ceremony for the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and the Frank and Virginia Williams Collection of Lincolniana Gallery. So we hope that you'll come back for that presentation. Thank you so much for being here.